Good afternoon and welcome to the John Carter Brown Library Associates 71st Annual Meeting. I'm Bill Twaddell, the chairman of the Associates. It's a pleasure to see you all here this afternoon, members of the Board of Governors, associates, fellows, members of the staff of the library, and friends. The Associates came into being in January of 1944 in this marvelous space. The event then was hosted by John Nicholas Brown and other organizers of the Associates grouping, including President Henry Riston of Brown, a scholar and aficionado of rare books, Wilmarth Lefty Lewis, and Brown's professor of American history, James Hedges, among others. The organization's purpose was to help the library acquire Americana resource materials, to sponsor certain library exhibitions, and to issue occasional publications. Some 200 attendees on that evening in January 1944 became charter associates, and for decades the group grew in energy and numbers to peak out at about 850 members in the late 1980s. And it's added several important functions since then. One is the conservation of our invaluable holdings, and very importantly, the underwriting of one or more of the JCB Research Fellowships after that program's initiation in 1962. You just saw this spring's associates doing selfies or getting a group photograph over here at the side of the room a moment ago. The associates have continued to flourish. In the last year, the associates funded 3 fellowships, attracting scholars from Newfoundland, Poland, and Chicago, who found the resources for their varied projects here at the JCB. Last year, our dues and contributions also helped acquire the books in that case on that side of the room, including a very interesting handbill that was printed on the first press in Santiago, Chile. And the handbill is entitled Vuelve el Día Feliz. It was published at the behest of the North American citizens resident in Santiago to celebrate the 4th of July, that wintry day in Santiago. And speaking of firsts, let me turn the microphone over to Neil. Although Neil is a former fellow himself and a Brown graduate, this is his first annual meeting of the Associates as Director Librarian. And in his first 6 months, he has been observing and imagining ways to sustain and reinvigorate this association. Neil.
Thank you, Bill, and thanks to everyone for being here, members of the Board of Governors, members of the Associates, members of the Brown community, the Providence community, and I should also add a special welcome to a resident of California, my father, who is here in the first row. So I hope you'll have a chance to say hi to him and see where I get my bad sense of humor. It is really a privilege, in fact, to be here at the first Associates meeting. I used to receive, as a former fellow, the invitations to the Associates lectures and evenings, and always used to kind of imagine what they would be like. And so it's really wonderful to actually be here today and to celebrate one of them. This has been a very exciting 6 months. It has been particularly exciting to arrive here at Brown in a semi-quincentenary year. And it occurred to me in reading over some of the meeting minutes from some of the previous associate meetings that associates' annual meetings were often the occasion for the inauguration of new exhibitions in a way to showcase the materials that had been acquired over the course of the year. And in fact, this year is no exception. We have here a wonderful exhibit that has been curated by a member of the Department of History, Jeremy Mumford, called Off to College, celebrating the particular contributions that American universities and American institutes of higher education have made at much earlier than, in fact, the period that Brown was founded. Spain's universities in Lima and Mexico City in 1551, some religious institutions in Brazil and New France, and also celebrating the similar curricular origins across the history of the Americas. So I hope you'll have a chance to take a look at the exhibit during the reception. You'll also notice, and this is a feature and will be a feature of all of our exhibitions going forward, that many of the items have what are called QR codes, essentially an opportunity to aim your smartphone or your iPad to particular volumes from the collection and have the actual digital replica of the particular object emerge. So we're quite excited about that. That is part of an ongoing effort to digitize and to share these incredible treasures with us, with the rest of the community, rather. So one of the things that I've been doing in the past few months is trying to imagine certain kind of programmatic initiatives that have been taking place at the library. We've already had activities on environmental history. We're going to have programs in indigenous history, including some special fellowships, special research fellows who are coming in, exhibits, and the like. We're also going to be looking at the Americas in a more global context. And tonight's lecture, I'm thrilled, even though I won't be introducing him, that we have John Demos with us, because his most recent book is actually bringing together many of the themes that are extremely relevant for some of those issues. Indigenous history of the United States, but also putting that indigenous history into a much broader context and connecting it with the different kinds of circuits and the different kinds of peoples who came to this country in the 18th century and into the early Republican period. So I also wanted to put in a plug for the upcoming exhibitions that we're going to be having after this one that you see before you. The next, which are part of a series, again, of programmatic initiatives. The next exhibit that we'll be showing will be curated by our curator of Latin American books, Ken Ward, on the history of the book in the Americas. This is to celebrate the 475th anniversary of the printing of the first book in the Americas. In the rare book world, there has been quite a kind of a buzz about the purchase of what was the first printed book in what would become the United States. I'm talking about the Bay Psalm book, printed in Cambridge, Massachusetts for 1640, which sold for a whopping $15 million at a Sotheby's auction house. We, of course, have a much better edition of that same book. It is not for sale. But 100 years earlier, in fact, the first printed book in the Americas was printed in Mexico City in 1539. Unfortunately, we don't have a copy of that book. In fact, no institution does, because we're not sure it still exists. But we have one that was produced a year or two later. So that is going to be absolutely at the heart of this new exhibition. We also have another exhibition following that one that will be about subterranean worlds, focusing on the history of mining in the Americas, but also focusing on the way in which different peoples throughout the Americas understood what was beneath the earth in a more general sense. This is going to inaugurate, in fact, a series of 4 exhibitions which will be on the 4 elements: earth, air, water, and fire, going along with our environmental initiative to focus on the history of astronomy, the history of the seas, and the history, at least as far as I can see, of something related to volcanism, but we'll get there, hopefully, in due course. In addition to planning many of these exhibits and programs, it has been really my pleasure to get to know the various constituencies of this library. That is, I think, its most important asset, even rivaling the incredible collection that it has. And it's been my sincere pleasure to get to know many of the associates who have supported so generously this institution since 1944. At the time of the Associates' founding in that year, they numbered 194, 110 of which were from Rhode Island, 82 from 17 other U.S. states, and 2 being former members. Now, the Associates has grown larger since that earlier period. It is engaged in acquiring books for the collection and also sponsoring the occasional publication. But it has also, as Bill pointed out, supported one of the most important elements of this library, which is the Fellows Program. I had the pleasure of attending the 50th anniversary of the Fellows Program just a mere 2 years ago. And at that time, there was great excitement about how the Fellows could participate. First of all, it was an incredible event, and we got to talk with one another and share stories and share research agendas. But we also, I think, felt collectively that we should do something to maintain the momentum and maintain the community that the Fellows engendered. And so what we have decided to explore further is, in fact, a new kind of what we call association. An association of friends, but also an association of fellows of the John Carter Brown Library, merging what are, in fact, 2 of our most important constituencies, that is, friends and fellows. In a sense, this would be a group for the library who could support its ongoing activities, as well as a kind of alumni network whereby former fellows could maintain an affiliation with the institution throughout their career and share in terms of the projects that they're doing, connect with fellows that are currently at the library in a more robust way, and hopefully come together at particular moments. And I will alert you to the fact that we are planning a kind of a large-scale reunion that will be essentially a year from now at the next Associates meeting. So this is something that we're going to be working on over the course of the next year. We will certainly, of course, keep you apprised of that. But one of the individuals that I have asked to help us in working on this new association with Bill Twaddell is actually somebody that I met when I was a fellow here at the library in 2002, and he also was a fellow of the library in 2002. As it happens, and this is purely circumstantial, he happens to be a long-term fellow here at the library this year as well. He has been a member of the Associates and, more importantly, a tireless advocate for the library. And I think that there are very few individuals who can speak more eloquently and passionately on behalf of this institution than my friend and colleague Matthew Restall. And I would ask for you to welcome him, and he's going to say a few words on his behalf. So thank you.
Just a few words, literally. I'm a very lucky man for several reasons. I won't detail them now, but I'm happy to later, not least of which is the fact that, as Neil said, I am a returning long-term fellow of the JCB and a member of the Associates for over a decade. And as such, I'm deeply grateful to the library. I'm passionately devoted to the JCB, and I'm a firm believer in the Associates, or the Association of Friends and Fellows, as we shall now be calling it. And it's therefore a great honor to have an opportunity not just to work with our dynamic new director, but to work with Bill, co-chairing the new association of friends and fellows and to exploring new ways to strengthen the JCB family of which you are all a part. Thank you, and back to Bill.
And now we move to the part of the program that always characterizes these annual meetings, a wonderful speech. And what we do here at the John Carter Brown Library rests on offering materials and scholarship. That scholarship is conducted to gain insight into the past as it is recorded in our amazing documents. These insights can inform us as we and posterity apply them to current realities. Tonight we have a special opportunity to hear about an early American educational experiment. It began with lofty goals, but did not succeed in the way that had been hoped for. We are still being educated by what took place at the Heathen school. It is a great pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, John Putnam Demos. He is an historian and author. He has written books that discuss the colonial witch hunts. And in the process of researches for those books, he discovered that one of his own ancestors, John Putnam Sr., was also progenitor to the Putnam family, which was prominent in the Salem witch trials, close to home. Professor Demos was awarded the Bancroft Prize for his book, Entertaining Satan. He received the Francis Parkman Prize for his book, Unredeemed Captive, A Family Story of Early America. Professor Demos retired in 2008 as the Samuel Knight Professor of History at Yale. He is retired, but he is not retired from authorship, and he is currently at work on a new book. After his talk this evening, you will have a chance to meet John and perhaps buy one of his books around the corner in the back in the Boulevard room. And it will also have the book on which tonight's topic is based, On the Trail of the Heathen School, Local History, American History, World History. And I would like just to make another footnote in this tight bonds of association. The exhibit that Neil mentioned and the work of Jeremy Mumford. Jeremy was a student of John's some years ago. John, please take the podium.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and an honor as well. I was saying to Neil at lunchtime with some amazement that I don't think I have crossed the threshold here for something like 40 years. Way back in my youth, I came here very profitably to do some witchcraft research. I remember well, actually, the documents. I remember the documents even better than the venue, which is so wonderful. It's great to be just standing in this wonderful hall. Anyway, how have I spent all these years not coming here? I think in my next life, I will put the JCB at the top of the list. So this talk is, as you've inferred, mainly about a new book, a book I published just a few weeks ago. I intend to sort of start the talk with a kind of thumbnail of the story that forms the heart of the book. But before I even do that, I want to say a few words about how I came to the story, or actually, to put it more accurately, how the story came to me. It started completely by chance. I have an old friend who has a house in the town of Cornwall, Connecticut, and way back in the mid-1990s, I've been at this project for a long time, off and on. One summer evening, my friend invited my wife and me down to his house for supper. It was a beautiful summer evening. We were standing around in the backyard with gin and tonics in our hands, I think, and one of the neighbors, who was also invited for dinner, began to tell me what he called a piece of local history. He thought I might be interested. I've been introduced as a history guy, and I think he thought this would be a good conversational starter. So he started to tell me this story, and he wasn't very far into it before I knew that I was not only interested, but really transfixed. I was so gripped by it that we went home that night and I couldn't sleep. And I got up the next morning and drove straight to the Yale campus. It was the middle of the summer, so college wasn't in session. But I drove down there and went to the library to see if anything much had been written or known about this story before. And the answer was not very much. There are some sort of more or less passing treatments of it, but no full-fledged book-length study. And from then on, I've been, as I say, off and on, and I'll say a little bit more about that later, at work on the story. But if I hadn't gone to dinner at my friend's house that night, you wouldn't be listening to me today. Okay, here's my thumbnail of the story that forms the heart of my book. The background, the context, in some broad sense, is a kind of national ethos of expansiveness in the opening years of the 19th century. The newly independent United States began at that point to reach out very substantially to the rest of the world in commerce, in its political ideals and ambitions, in its go-ahead spirit, as they like to say. And one especially powerful expression of this outreach was the China trade. A rapid growth of trade with the Far East, centered in the Chinese city of Canton. Dozens and dozens of ships heading out that way every year and returning loaded with cargoes of tea and silk and many other China-made goods, things that Americans of that era really wanted to own and use. Well, travel to China for all these trade ships typically involved a mid-ocean stopover in the Hawaiian Islands, where they could rest and have some fun and restock for the rest of the journey. And this might also lead to some reshuffling of personnel, with a few young Hawaiian men coming on board as crew. And these Hawaiians might then go wherever the trade ships took them, and some might eventually be let off in one or another part of the United States, most often, I think, in New England. Fast forward now to what is the first major scene in this drama, this story that forms the heart of my book. It's an autumn day in the year 1809. The setting is the steps of Yale College, where students are passing in and out on their way to class. On this particular morning, there's something a little different. Off to one side sits a young man who doesn't appear to really belong there. He's dark-skinned and wearing ragged sailor clothes, and he's quietly weeping. After a while, the Yale students notice him and feel concerned and ask him the reason for his distress. And he replies in broken English, "Because nobody gives me learning." In short, he wants some of what the Yale students are getting. And this, I think, is certain to get their attention. He's a Hawaiian, a kind of cast-off from the China trade, in which he's worked as a deckhand for the previous couple of years. He had just recently been put ashore in New Haven and somehow found his way to Yale College. His name is Obukaya. That's his Hawaiian surname. And at some point, I imagine while working alongside American sailors, he'd taken the forename Henry. Okay, Henry Obukaya was then quickly taken under the wing of a number of Yale students. In response to his wish, they began to give him language lessons, the English language, and to tutor him in other academic subjects, and not least to instruct him in the essentials of religious faith, the Christian faith. Yale was at the time a very religious place. I don't think one could say the same thing about Yale today. quite a lot has changed. Well, one thing leads to another, and the education and conversion of Obokaya becomes a kind of campus-wide project. Perhaps I'm exaggerating a bit here, but I do think his presence was openly acknowledged on campus, so much so, in fact, that he was soon taken into the home of the college president, a Protestant minister of great eminence named Timothy Dwight, Reverend Timothy Dwight. Yale today has a residential college called Timothy Dwight, where I myself have been a faculty fellow for many years. Oops. Anyway, Dwight, quite a few of the students, and also some outsiders who came to have a look at this rather extraordinary scene, all get deeply involved. And Obokaya begins to make good progress, both in his language learning and in his spiritual condition as well. And after several months, it's decided that he should go elsewhere to continue the same process. He's taken for a time to an academy, a secondary school in Massachusetts, and then for several years to follow, he sort of passed around among different ministers' households where he visits for weeks or months at a time. Reports of his arrival and progress are published in religious newspapers and journals, and he's on his way to what could almost be called a kind of celebrity status. And his story, his steadily building achievements, lead people to wonder whether something similar might be done for others like him, other heathen people in far-flung parts of the world who, like him, lack education, lack civilized ways of living, and most of all, lack any knowledge of the Christian faith. In short, Obokaya becomes the germ, the seed of a powerful new missionary idea. As it all plays out, President Dwight and other top-level ministers nearby hatch a plan to set up a special school for heathen youth at which an Obokaya-like transformation can be accomplished on a much wider scale. It will have the official name of the Foreign Mission School, although informally it quickly becomes known simply as the Heathen School. Its location will be the town of Cornwall, Connecticut. A principal, a minister named Herman Daggett, is appointed, and also some additional staff. Buildings are acquired, and in the spring of 1817, it opens for business. There are about a dozen students, generally referred to as the scholars, in this first group. Several Hawaiians, including Obokaya, he's kind of the star, and a couple of young men from India, a Native American, an Abenaki, and a couple of white New Englanders. They are training to become missionaries overseas, and it's thought that up-close contact with heathens would be helpful and instructive for them. Soon there will be more, additional Hawaiians, other Pacific Islanders, several from China, a Mexican, a few European Jews, a couple of Greeks. That surprised me a bit. I'm of Greek extraction myself, but evidently in those days Greeks were considered to be heathen. Who knew? And also, as time passed, there was a growing number of American Indians, Cherokees, Choctaws, Iroquois, Ojibwa. In all, I think about 15 different Indian groups would eventually be represented at the school. I've got to skip lightly over the actual workings of the school, but I want to emphasize, in fact, it would be hard to overemphasize the sweeping, intensely felt hopes and ambitions that underlay this whole project. The idea was that the graduates would return to their various homelands and start similar projects there, schools and churches that would in turn promote the civilizing, quote unquote, and Christian conversion of their own people. In short, there was a kind of multiplier effect built into the heart of this whole scheme. If all went well, the entire world would be saved. That was the key word, saved, in the shortest time imaginable. And as one final flourish here, the Bible suggested that conversion of all previously heathen people, wherever they lived, would be a precursor to the start of the long-anticipated millennium, the kingdom of God on earth. It takes a certain amount of imagination to realize that quite a few people in the early 19th century, mostly evangelicals of one sort or another, felt they had a reasonable shot at seeing the start of the millennium within their lifetimes. One particular happening in the school's first year deserves special mention. Henry Obukaya, who, as I've said, had been a kind of star from the beginning, he took sick with a case of typhus, and after lingering for several painful weeks, he died. And the school's sponsors and leaders then seized the chance to construe his passing as a kind of martyr's death. Almost at once, one of his teachers began to write his biography, which would be published a few months later under the title The Memoirs of Henry Obukaya, and which became pretty much a national or even international bestseller. Many thousands, many tens of thousands of copies would be printed and sold in the coming years. I think there were at least a dozen different reprintings. It was so popular, in fact, that copies occasionally turn up even today, such as this one that I found in a Harvard Square bookstore a few years ago. As a result, interest in the school and support for the school shot up dramatically, whether that's measured in fundraising, in visits by outsiders. The school became a kind of tourist destination, in newspaper publicity, and so on. All this while, the school leaders were churning out a lot of highly favorable PR, insisting that everything was going splendidly and according to plan. In fact, however, this was not quite the truth. You don't have to read too far between the lines of their own internal records to see that there were serious problems right from the start. Problems in the classroom. One of the teachers complained it was such a diverse group, you had to have almost as many classes as students. Problems also of discipline. Students kept running away, playing the truant, quote unquote, as they said, and quite a few had to be expelled for one or another kind of misconduct. Still, for a time, several years, they managed to maintain for the school a good public reputation. Then something happened that was not part of the plan. Can you guess? Romance developed between some of the heathen youth and a few young women of Cornwall. As I say, not part of the plan. I imagine them thinking it's one thing we should bring you here and educate you and convert you and civilize you, and quite another thing that you should court and marry our daughters. The first actual case of this kind involved a young Cherokee named John Ridge and the 16-year-old daughter of the school steward. The steward was the staff person who took care of all the material needs of the scholars, their food, clothing, occasional travel, stuff like that. The girl's name was Sarah Northrup, and it did take a while for John and Sarah's courtship to develop, and for about 2 years it was a closely guarded secret among just a few of the principals. But eventually it did come out and sparked an immediate uproar and controversy, first locally around Cornwall, then as the news spread out across the state, and even finally to other parts of the country. Intermarriage between people of different race was simply unacceptable, was, I think, anathema to a great majority of Americans of that time. Eventually, however, John and Sarah did marry in spite of the uproar and went off to John's home in the Cherokee Nation in what is today North Georgia. The school tried to tamp down public feeling by claiming that it was a one-time thing prompted by some very unusual circumstances, and promising that it would never happen again. But within scarcely a year more, it did happen again. Another Cherokee student, Elias Boudinot, and a young woman from one of the town's leading families, Harriet Gold, became engaged and also got married. So the previous controversy was renewed and, if anything, intensified with lots of impassioned, indignant rhetoric, threats to destroy the school buildings, and a night of public protest on the town green at which Elias and Harriet were burned in effigy. With the result that this second intermarried pair left town as quickly as possible, and like the first pair, went off to the Cherokee Nation. By now, the school was doomed. Public feeling was fully aroused against it. The donations which had sustained it were in steep decline, and the leaders became concerned that its continuance might put the entire missionary movement at risk. So they shut the school down for good and did their best, I think, to suppress public memory of it. I'm running out of time for this piece of my talk, but there's a kind of tail end of the story, as I tell it in the book, that I want at least to mention. John Ridge and Elias Boudinot, when they got home to the Cherokees, quickly became leaders of their own people. And this is where the little story, so to speak, of the Heathen school intersects with the much bigger story of national growth and development. By now, it's the 1830s, and the federal government is pressing the Cherokees, along with other Indians of the Lower South, to accept removal from their traditional homeland to new locations much further west, mostly in what today is the state of Oklahoma. I imagine you know the headlines of this. There's a famous Supreme Court case which seems to favor the Cherokees by declaring removal to be an unconstitutional violation of their rights. But then the administration of President Andrew Jackson refuses to enforce the court's decision, and in due course, forced removal happens. This is what history knows as the Cherokee Trail of Tears. Well, as leaders of their nation, Ridge and Boudinot were at the center of the whole struggle around removal. At first, and for some years, they led the opposition to removal, negotiating with federal officials up to and including President Jackson himself, defending the rights of the Cherokees to remain where they were. But at a certain point, they flipped and became leaders of a minority faction that accepted the idea of removal, or as they preferred to call it, emigration. From then on, their negotiation was directed toward setting the terms of a treaty to that effect. And what came to be called the Treaty of New Echota, sponsored by the Ridge-Boudinot group and agreeing to removal of all the Cherokees, was actually signed in Elias Boudinot's living room. This made them, in the eyes of most of their fellow Cherokees, nothing less than traitors. And when the removal process had been completed and the nation was fully relocated in Oklahoma, Ridge and Boudinot were murdered by tribal opponents on the same morning, June 22, 1839, in a kind of coordinated double assassination. This was a sensational event reported across the country, and it led to decades of reprisals and revenge killings within the Cherokee Nation. To this day, Ridge and Boudinot are remembered with bitterness by a good many Cherokees. Final question. Why did these two flip on the removal question? Well, what they said publicly was that there was no hope if the Cherokees had to remain where they were. They were vastly overmatched and outnumbered by the federal government and by all the white people of the Lower South who would insist on nothing less than complete removal. However, I think there was something more, something they expressed only privately and indirectly. In effect, When Jackson refused to enforce the crucial Supreme Court decision, they felt deeply betrayed. Betrayed in a public way on behalf of all Cherokees, but also with a kind of private and personal resonance reaching back to their time years before in Cornwall at the Heathen School. There, too, they were betrayed. Having been at first approved and admired as star students, then reviled and cast out when they fell in love with women in the white community and crossed the race line. Faced with what the Jackson administration had thrown against them, they felt, we've seen this script before. We know where it leads. Best we should take our people as far away as possible from such double-dealing antagonists. Or to put it more bluntly, you can't trust the white man. My words, not theirs, but I do believe that was their thought. And of course, it's something that Indian people have had to reckon with over and over again. As I say, that's where the little story and the big story intersect with inevitably tragic consequences. There were other results of the Heathen School story as well. For one thing, the Protestant missionary movement as a whole essentially reversed strategy, concluding that it would do better from here on if it centered its work overseas by going to where the heathen actually lived instead of bringing them here to America, where potentially damaging issues of race might once again explode. Well, that's it for my thumbnail. What I'd like to do next is say a bit about why the story so gripped me that evening when I first heard about it at my friend's house in Cornwall, and why it stayed with me for all these years of research and writing, and why I think it has an importance going well beyond its immediate particulars. There are three underlying themes, three elements that form what might be called the deep background to the story. And this is the one part of my talk where I'm going to dip into the book itself and extract a few published paragraphs. One of these themes is the enduring legacy of American exceptionalism. At their best, our national traditions have fostered a generous spirit of outreach toward neighboring peoples and nations, a feeling of obligation, not to say mission, to make the world as a whole a better place. Think the Marshall Plan after World War II. Think the Peace Corps. Think the ever-ready offers of American-driven relief following disasters all around the globe. Quote, "For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill, the eyes of all people are upon us," unquote, John Winthrop famously declared while leading the first band of English men and women to colonize Massachusetts, 1630. And that idea, America as a redeemer nation, showing others the way to broad gauge human improvement, has been with us ever since. To be sure, exceptions to this exceptionalism intrude. Generosity may slide into arrogant presumption, helpfulness into imperialism. All of our country's wars fought in my lifetime had as their declared purpose something more than national aggrandizement. Most were, in one way or another, meant to protect and advance humane values thought to be characteristically American: freedom, democracy, opportunity. Yet some of them, in hindsight, or even at the time, have a markedly downside look. In short, it's been part of America's history, this redemptive project, this crusader mentality, all along. It's been creative and destructive, glorious and tragic, noble and ignoble by turns. Inevitably, attitudes toward it will differ, but there is no doubting its power as a key historical theme. It both frames and suffuses the story of the Heathen School. Let me do a quick sidebar here of a more personal nature. My father, as I've sort of already mentioned, was an immigrant as a young man from Greece. He came with nothing and forged what became a remarkably successful professional career. My mother is a different kind of immigrant. She grew up poor in a tiny town in the far Pacific Northwest and also came east and was extremely upwardly mobile. And both my parents would have said, only in America. So there's a sense in which I feel that the American exceptionalism theme is in my DNA. The truth is I've been long looking for a history project where I could engage it directly. And that's one of the reasons I think I responded so fast that night in Cornwall to the story of the Heathen school. A second large theme at the story's center is what the critic Svetlana Todorov calls the discovery self makes of the other. How do we deal with others who are manifestly different from ourselves? This, of course, is not a specifically American question, nor is it only a history question. Rather, it has a broadly existential grounding. It's generic, it's part of the human condition. It takes many forms: difference of race, of class, of gender, of culture, of religion, of age, of sexual orientation, and so on. Each one of us confronts it in our private lives every day. Yet in America, the United States of America, it has acquired a public depth and coloration. For the bedrock fact of human difference has shaped our collective experience from the start. The three-way encounter of our colonial period, Indians, Europeans, and Africans, was extraordinary. The old world across the Atlantic had nothing like it, and this was only the beginning. The magnetic force of our national project has continued to draw into our midst people of every stripe and condition. The Heathen School was a microcosm of the struggles rooted in this part of our history. There is a third key element to mention up front. It may sound counterintuitive, but no matter. This is a story of failure. Its dark, tragic end lies far from its bright beginning. As such, it's not the sort of thing writers and readers of American history commonly look for. The national narrative we favor has a triumphalist score. Progress is its central note. Yet our history is strewn with failures, large and small, projects gone awry from poor planning or bad luck, ideas missing their mark, emotions running amok, and especially in an exceptional country, the hubris of overreaching. Many of these are forgotten almost as soon as they conclude. Often a feeling of shame attaches to them. Sometimes the groups most directly involved acknowledge them only to claim a lesson learned and a reason to move on as fast as possible. Yet most failures do, at the very least, tell us something about who we are as a people. We ignore them at our cost. Of course, every individual life knows personal failure, moments of falling down or falling short. From this, too, much can be learned. As Samuel Beckett has written, ever tried, ever failed, no matter, try again, failed better. In sum, America as a redeemer nation, the encounter of self with other, the shape and substance of failure, plus the inherent drama of the story itself, reasons enough for me to write this book, and dare I hope for others to read it. I'm not finished. Is it okay if I say a little more? I wasn't quite finished. The title for this talk includes right up front the phrase, "on the trail of the Heathen School." And that's meant to allude to the process side of it all. What came up along the way, what it took to get to the end of the story and to the book itself. And there are a couple things I'd like to say on that score. The first is about some of the characters at the center of the story. I mean the clergy, the missionary-minded Protestant ministers who conceived and ran the school. To be frank, I had a hard time with them. I was, in some ways I guess I still am, not very sympathetic with their hopes and goals. To the contrary, I had strong reservations, a lot of inner resistance to their whole attitude and point of view. This surprised me at first. I've spent much of my historian's life studying and writing about the so-called Puritans of a somewhat earlier part of American history. And although I'm not myself religiously inclined, I never felt any particular difficulty with Puritans and their own profoundly religious orientation. In fact, I found many things about them to admire, not least their capacity for self-questioning and even for self-doubt. Well, their descendants, spiritual descendants in the early 19th century, including the leaders of the Foreign Mission School, were a different breed. To be quite blunt, they seemed to me, as I began to spend a lot of time with them, astonishingly self-assured, self-satisfied, and utterly lacking in doubt as to their basic purposes. At their worst, they seemed arrogant, even smug. Moreover, alongside the hopes they held out for saving the heathen, I could sense their deep aversiveness, disgust even, for their heathen charges. And as an overall result, I felt quite alienated from them. And there was a further problem, too. They were, of necessity, my leading sources. They produced most of the evidence on which any reconstruction of the heathen school story would have to be based. And I didn't think I could fully trust them. Their determination to portray everything about the school in the most favorable possible light led them to an extremely selective presentation of the facts. They were masters of PR. They were always spinning. And only in their most private communications did they confess to anything at all on the downside. So I got stuck. I just didn't like them. I didn't trust them. It was a big problem. And the result was that I dropped the project, not once, but twice, for several years each time. That's my excuse for taking so long with it. Eventually, though, after enough time had passed, I did come back to it and could sort of make my peace with them. I guess I was able to muster enough imagination and empathy to not exactly to accept their point of view, but to understand, really understand that they were operating within their own cultural frame of reference and that their intentions, at least, were mostly good. Seemed a simple enough point, but it took me a while to get there. And as for their reliability as sources, one could develop a certain sensitivity and practice a kind of between-the-lines reading that might serve to correct what otherwise lay on the surface. So, as I say, the problem more or less resolved itself. There was as well a different source problem involving the other main group of actors in this story. I mean, all the heathen youth for whose benefit the school was established and operated. The problem there was essentially one of silence. How very nice it would be to hear their viewpoint on their own experience at the receiving end of all this strenuous missionary and educational effort. Well, it wasn't going to happen, at least not in any direct way. Pretty much across the board, the exit records do not allow us to hear directly from them. That's true even in the case of those few who became major public figures, like John Ridge and Elias Boudinot. We can learn quite a lot about their later careers, but very little about the years when they were actually present at the school. We do have the Obukaya memoir, but that little book was itself considerably doctored by a kind of ghostwriter. So what's a historian to do? How can he reach out to fill this void and give at least something of the other side? I didn't. I couldn't fully respond to this difficulty, but I did almost unwittingly make one move that seemed to help. At some point, fairly far along in the process, I got the idea of going to visit some of the places from which these young men had come. I went first to Hawaii. Again, it was not a carefully strategized move, but I thought that just possibly I might find something there that would deepen my understanding of what it meant for Obukaya and the other Hawaiian scholars to make such an extraordinary journey, not just their spatial journey, but the cultural one as well. Besides, how often does a chance for a research trip to Hawaii come along? Most of my previous research trips have been about as far as Worcester. Well, in fact, that is essentially what happened. From going there, from being there, from seeing the landscape, from immersion in the cultural and historical traditions of that amazing place, I did feel a deeper level of understanding. And when I got back from Hawaii, I did the same thing with the Cherokees, went to the area of their original homeland, North Georgia, without any specific agenda, aiming for another experience of spatial and cultural immersion. And finally, when that too was finished, I could look at Cornwall itself, Cornwall as a place, through a kind of a different lens. From these three different ventures emerged what is probably the most eccentric or unconventional part of my book, a set of interludes, as I've called them, in which the historian author himself takes a direct role on stage. I've worried some that this little trio might seem to readers a kind of indulgence. Still, I'm pretty convinced that they add something to all the rest and help, at least part way, to fill in what might be called the other side of the story. You know, there's a larger point here as well about the power of place. I learned about that too from following the trail of the Heathen school. That's it. Thanks very much for hearing me out.
We'll answer some questions.
Oh, sure.
Professor Demos has agreed to answer some questions. Before he does, however, I did just want to say a couple of things about how the topic for this book actually falls outside, as many of you are aware, of the traditional chronological range of the JCB's collection. But I think one of the things that you've demonstrated so ably, both in the book and in this lecture, is that the legacies of a lot of the dynamics that were set in course during the 18th century, and in fact even earlier, have a very relevant kind of stretch into the 19th century, the 20th century, and there's certainly legacies that we'll be living with today. I should also add that in one of the, as I was looking back over some of the minutes of the associate meeting, and particularly the minutes from 1957, which announced, I should add, in the presence of Poe Adams, the arrival of Mr. and Mrs. Adams to the library on that evening. They waited by the fireplace to receive well-wishers. That there was some concern among several, actually this was 8 years later, when Tom Adams invited somebody to give a talk, and there was some concern that he expressed on the talk going on too long, I thought, when you sort of stopped abruptly. And he said, he mentioned that, you know, it should not go on for more than about 35 or 40 minutes, lest those who have dined before and perhaps had too much to drink should get a little bit beyond their abilities to stay awake. But it was incredibly riveting, and so thank you very much, and we now open it to questions from the audience.
Glad to hear from you, sure. Yeah.
What were they thinking
Be- because of, I don't know how to say it, because of the race line. They said I think it really did not occur to them that this particular element would develop in the school. I'm trying to think. There's even a quote in the book that sort of alludes to this. It sort of says, one of the ministers, I think, who knew that these young men would think that they could possibly aspire to marry one or another of our daughters. I think we have to really understand how powerful that kind of feeling was. Now, it's, yeah. Sorry.
The daughters clearly didn't share.
Oh, that's right. They didn't share that, and I should say, and in a more extended presentation of all this, I would have made more allowance for some differences of opinion. It's not like everybody was horrified by intermarriage. In fact, there were some in the missionary movement itself who were horrified that this should be, discountenanced. In fact, people said, look, in the Bible it doesn't say anywhere that people can't marry across racial lines. But you're right. The young women themselves, this was not their point of view. There's a wonderful quote from Harriet Gold, of which I can only remember a few words, but talking about her, I think at that point, husband-to-be, Elias Boudinot, she said, his soul is as white as mine. It doesn't matter what color his skin is. There's some quite beautiful lines that emerge from some of the characters in the story, I think especially from people like Harriet Gold. Thank you, yeah.
Did the widows go back to Cornwall, or what happened?
Well, okay, good question. Harriet Gold died 10 years after she went to the Cherokee Nation, just before removal. She was bearing, at that point, I think it was her 6th or 7th child, and something happened in the delivery. She got sepsis of some kind, I guess, and she died. Elias Boudinot, who was initially just stricken and devastated by this, in fairly short order found a second wife, another New England woman, actually, who was already working down in the nation as a school teacher, I think. And when he was murdered, his second wife took the children back to New England and raised some of them herself and left others with siblings of Harriet's, other members of the Gold family. As for Sarah Northrop Ridge, she was, alas, right there when he was murdered. A group of, so to say, executioners had come to the house early one morning, had grabbed Ridge out of bed and rather brutally killed him just outside the front door as his wife watched, and indeed his children watched. It was a particularly horrifying scene, no doubt. She was also devastated and sort of, some people feared for her sanity, they say, for a period of a couple of weeks. But then she pulled herself together. She knew she had to for her sake of her kids. And she moved to the town of Fayetteville, Arkansas, where she lived for another 20 or 30 years, raised her children, became a kind of leading light, I think, of Fayetteville. Her house is, I haven't been to Fayetteville, but I'm told that it's the oldest still standing house in Fayetteville. So that's basically the story, the aftermath of this whole business. There's several hands up. Okay, thanks.
Is there any parallel with white captives who were taken by Indian tribes and integrated into the tribe? Or is that a different story?
Well, funny you should mention that, because I wrote a book about that kind of thing too. Any parallel? I mean, the parallel is intermarriage in one sense. Although in the case of in the case I know best, which is the one I wrote about, the case of Eunice Williams of Deerfield, the unredeemed captive, it's somehow more than intermarrying. It's becoming fully Indianized, and actually becoming, in her case, Catholic, which may have been even worse from the standpoint of her Williams family relatives than her becoming an Indian. It was a kind of wholesale transformation. I suppose, I probably haven't thought through enough the comparisons between my two projects, but what happened to her was sort of what, in reverse, was sort of what the leaders of the missionary school expected would happen with the heathen youth that they brought. I mean, if it's not already clear, I think the idea of fully transforming these young men in almost every possible way, not just kind of religiously, but otherwise too, was impossible. And I think they set themselves a task that could not be realized. That's the overreaching part. People ask me, as I've gone around pitching this book here and there, is there a lesson to be learned from the story? Well, I guess the lesson is pretty simple. It's the danger of overreaching. Yeah.
This is such an interesting story. I've read the book. Really
I'm sorry, I can't hear. Can you see?
I really like the book.
Okay.
I read the book.
Oh, you read the book.
Really appreciate it. And I have a question about, since you're talking about space and the importance of space and the space giving voices to the people, what happened in Cornwall after all this was over? And how was the school remembered? And, I mean, now there's a local historian talking to you about it, but is that recent that they've re-embraced the history of the school, or was it a buried history for a long time?
I can't honestly answer in great detail that good question. My guess is that for much of the 19th century and on into the 20th century, it was sort of buried or set aside where it wasn't much noticed. It surely is, however, described in fact, one of the longest previous descriptions is in a local town history of Cornwall. I think they've come in recent years to a kind of greater, appreciation of it. I'll mention one very neat thing that happened in Cornwall about 2 or 3 summers ago. The local historical society put on an exhibition about the Foreign Mission School, and they had a wonderful little array of artifacts and so on, and they had speakers like me to come and talk. And on the occasion of the exhibition, a number of descendants of the principals, especially Ridges and Boudinot's, came to Cornwall, I think in most cases, if not all, maybe for the first time. So these are people who are direct descendants. I was very thrilled, in fact, to meet some of them and talk to them. Many of them are successful professional or business people scattered across the country now. Some came from as far away as California, as I recall. Anyway, as a kind of culmination of the event, the Gold family, the present-day members of the Gold family, held a dinner for the descendants of the Cherokee, the Cherokee attendees. Only descendants on the two sides were invited, which I thought was a very nice touch. I did question people afterwards about what it was like. I would love to have been a fly on the wall. But they said it was just a very pleasant evening, and one of them said to me, it was just great to catch up with other members of our family. Our family. There was a kind of closure, I felt. So I loved that, a little story from just a couple of years ago. I put it into the book, as I guess you know if you read it.
I'm just thinking that our family here revels in the opportunity to meet and greet one another, so I don't want to cut into our time. For those of you who have more questions, Professor Demos will be here, so please join us for the reception. And firstly, however, join me in thanking John Demos for a fabulous talk.